Thanks for joining us. I'm talking with JP Fournier, the Executive Director of the Digital Investment Office today. We're continuing the conversation from the Digital BC livestream on fixing digital funding. Thank you to the many people that completed the survey. It helps us figure out ways to improve future Digital BC livestreams and podcasts. For example, we heard in the most recent survey on this topic that people resonated with this conversation, and there was interest in hearing practical examples and stories from beginning to end. Therefore, a big part of today's conversation focuses on discussing practical examples and stories from beginning to end. JP, one of the many things I enjoyed learning at the Digital BC livestream was that you had been thinking about and planning on improving digital funding for years before starting this work. I love hearing stories about people's passions and commitment to creating better experiences. I look forward to delving further into this with you today. We have many outstanding questions about fixing digital funding to discuss. So, without further ado, welcome, JP. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ari.
All right, here we go. In the Data BC livestream, you shared your thoughts on a question. Can you tell us a little bit more about your fast path from data jockey to fixer of government funding before you started? And do you have one or two stories to share about that?
Absolutely. I think I'd summarize my path as being in the right place at the right time and having a good series of bosses who took a chance on me at times. During the live stream, we talked a little bit about my path starting from data jockey, hand bombing data from giant spreadsheets into a database. How did I get from there to here? I think the first thing was actually a program called Startup in Residence that came about 5-6 years ago, around there. The idea of that program was, what if we could put a problem out to the market rather than a 300-page RFP, as government has been known to do in the past, put a problem out there and incentivize more nimble startup type companies to come work with us to solve that problem. So kind of a test of outcomes-based procurement. Now, at the time, I sure had a big problem on my hands and sure could use some help to fix it. And so I heard about this program and thought, perfect. I've got the perfect opportunity. Let's frame this up and let's see if we can get a startup company to come work with us. Now, as part of that program, you didn't just get access to working with a startup company. It was put on by the Ministry of Jobs, Trade and Technology at the time, and they had this whole rich program built around it where you got education, you learned about product management, you learned about Scrum, you learned about digital delivery models. They even had David Eves, who was at Harvard at the time, Harvard Kennedy School of Government, come into town and give a talk about it. And so through all of that training that I got through Startup in Residence, my eyes got completely opened up to this new world and these new ways of working. Now, I also worked with an incredible little Vancouver-based startup company at the time named Arcit. And that taught me a lot as well about modern digital ways of working. So from there, I had a great experience working with Arcit through the Startup in Residence program, and my bosses at the time asked me to take on a product manager role for the first time. And so I had an opportunity to pivot a team into the Exchange Lab at the time. I think it was still called the Continuous Service Improvement Lab. And so I did that and got to learn all about standing up and running an agile team to develop and ship a digital product. So back then I was working on a public engagement tool in the natural resource sector, and I learned all about how to build a team, how to do a proper inception, how to do user research and service design, and how to incrementally build out a product or service. Now, at the time, a lot of teams in the Continuous Service Improvement Lab didn't really have a plan post-development. So they were all doing amazing development work and working on the latest and greatest technology that government had access to, but none of them had a plan for sustaining or let alone continuously improving their product or service once it went live. And that was definitely irking me at the time. what good is it in my mind to ship something in weeks rather than years when it's just going to be out of date in a couple of years? That's not actually all that helpful. And so that problem really drove me to learn more. And at the time, I decided to go back to school, do a master's in business, and really learn the boring basics, as I thought of it at the time: accounting, finance, all those things that sort of make the world tick. I didn't really feel I had the knowledge at the time to solve these hard problems. And I had this sense that going back to school might help me. So went back, did my master's while working full time. And that was just amazing, rich experience. And I got to complement day-to-day on the job learning with all these new skills and frameworks that helped me do my job. Now, around that time, I got an invitation from Startup in Residence program actually comes back here. So they invited me to take on leadership of the program as the director responsible for it. And so I moved over to the Ministry of Jobs, Trade and Technology. We were there for maybe 4 or 5 months, and then we got pulled into the Office of the Chief Information Officer and switched ministries, moved to the Ministry of Citizen Services, moved into the Office of the Chief Information Officer, and then my world, things were a little bit of a whirlwind, but I wound up leading the Office of the Chief Information Officer's strategy function and developed and implemented government's first digital framework at the time. So that's a little bit of my story.
Okay, thank you. That is a really good story. You know, it's been a long time since I heard Startup in Residence, but the stuff that they were coming up with was really neat. And seeing them at conferences share their work, and just that start of where it went to moving the lab forward. I like hearing how you talked about it, how it went almost hand in hand for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So fast forward, I had landed in the Office of the Chief Information Officer as sort of leading the province's digital strategy function. Did that, developed the digital framework, launched it, left government for a hot minute, and came back in the pandemic to work on the province's pandemic response. And this time I was actually part of the Exchange Lab, interestingly enough. And my job was a whole mix of everything. It was strategy, policy, leading delivery teams, designing, building, and shipping common components. It was just an absolute blast of a job where I got to do all kinds of different things and work with partners across government on some of the coolest problems I'll probably ever work on. It was incredible. So I did that for about 2 years, and then successfully applied on the executive director of Digital Investment Office. And you might be thinking, wow, Exchange Lab to the Digital Investment Office? How does that make sense? At the time, I was obsessive when I was in the Exchange Lab about, again, the boring basics, understanding accounting and policy and finance and how all of that knit together. And I wrote a few policy papers at the time on topics related to digital funding, and worked hands-on with teams to sort of design their approach to funding their new digital program or service or product. Picked up a lot of hands-on skills doing that I parlayed into this new job.
I like that you talk about fundamentals a lot, whether it be taking your MBA or working on policy and stuff like that. To do creative, fun stuff, you have to have really, really good fundamentals to be able to even try to do it properly.
Absolutely. Any pro athlete will tell you that. Any scientist, the best writers, all of them have one thing in common, which is they spend a lot of time focusing on the fundamentals.
So now that you are the executive director of the Digital Investment Office, please tell us a story of what it's really like.
Yeah, it's a really interesting job. So I think one of the things that surprises me most is that I think people, when they come talk to me at first, are a little bit nervous and think, oh, what's he going to do? Are they going to take my money or something like that? And I think one of the most interesting things I've learned so far in the job is just the importance of empathy. So anyone who's been around the space of delivering digital products and services in the last 10 years knows it's a really challenging environment. These things aren't easy at the best of times. And so whenever I talk to someone who's delivering a particularly challenging one, it's amazing the relief that I see in people's faces when one of the first things I say is, wow, this must be really, really hard. I find that empathy is something that is sometimes lacking in some of the central agencies or the governance functions in government organizations anywhere really, and that leading with empathy really helps there to get people to relax, open up, and let you help them. I think that's one of the most interesting things I've learned so far in the job.
To that, I think of government because of one of my mentors / directors over the years, Heather Remical, got me into one team government. And I just like that philosophy of government. It's like we're all one big team. So the empathy, we're all trying our best to get our stuff somewhere valuable for the citizens. So let's have empathy for everyone in our team.
Absolutely. This is one of the most government organizations are some of the most mission oriented and have some of the most talented, dedicated, passionate people of anywhere I've ever worked.
Me too. And it's 6 years back, and it's impressive the people who are here and how much they give. So among digital teams across government, there's sometimes a sense that capital funding is a challenge or barrier to modern digital ways of working. What do you think about that?
In short, I think that I disagree. And the reason is, I think, let's start with definitions. So capital funding isn't something that's really up for debate. Its definition is really clear in Canada in the Public Sector Accounting Handbook, really clear in Core Policy and Procedures Manual for us in BC, and something that teams should always refer to their CFOs and their teams to help with. So maybe I'll start with a couple of those definitions. And apologies, Ari, this is an example of me starting with the boring basics and the fundamentals, but I'll bore us for a moment and start with definitions. So let's start with the question, what is a capital expense? It's a cost that results in an asset, which is something that has future economic value or is used to deliver services. What that means from a financial perspective, it shows up in two places in public accounts. It shows up in the statement of cash flows, which shows the cash that is used to buy or build a capital asset. And it also shows up in the statement of financial position, also known as a balance sheet. And that's where the asset that's built as part of a capital project shows up. Now, let's talk for a second about operating costs. Those are day-to-day costs, in short. Things like maintenance or internal staffing costs or perhaps prototyping, just regular expenses that happen day to day. Those definitions are pretty crystal clear in Public Sector Accounting Handbook and Core Policy, and so I don't really think that saying capital is a problem really makes a ton of sense. My sense is the real problem is more that when a lot of people hear IT or digital product or digital service, they automatically jump to, in their mind, capital. And I think the difference is capital is just a small part of the life cycle of a product or service. There's a lot of activity that happens before a capital expense happens, things like user research, requirements gathering in the waterfall world, service design, prototyping, all those things you need to do to figure out, to frame a path forward and decide if something is a good idea and get a decision made on whether it's a go or a no-go. All of those sorts of things that happen early on in the life cycle of any product or service are operating costs. And sometimes people forget about those and think that all they need is a business case, a piece of paper. And really, there's a lot of work up front that needs to go into digital products and services. I think of capital in many cases as, in our digital product and service world, as scale funding. It's how you get from a discovery phase or prototyping phase or requirements gathering phase. How do you go from there to a live product that's actually being used by people? I think that's where capital really plays into the product and service delivery life cycle. And then we can't forget about the back end. So digital products and services change as policy changes and user needs change, tech changes. And so you need to maintain technology, continuously improve it, make sure it remains responsive. And that's also typically under government's core policy considered operating expenses. And sometimes, as I mentioned on the front end when I was in the Exchange Lab early on, a lot of the teams around me hadn't really planned for that either. And so when I hear people say capital is broken, I think that's wrong. Instead, I think what's broken is how do we organize funding to better reflect the rhythms of digital delivery teams and that full product and service life cycle? How do you sort of blend the right mix of funding for teams? I think the last thing I would say is anybody who's struggling with this, my top recommendation is have a chat with your chief financial officer or your corporate finance team. They are extremely helpful for navigating this kind of thing.
Oh, I appreciate it. I assume this question will be listened to many times over. Do you see a shift from capital to operating for IT over what sort of time frame?
I definitely do. Although I'll state up front, I don't see this being because of changes in policy interpretation or accounting treatment. I see it happening because of market trends. And I'll give you a few examples. So let's start with infrastructure, things like server and hosting and storage. It used to be 20 years ago that organizations like us invested in big data centers and bought servers that ran in those data centers for 3 to 5 years sometimes, and that was how infrastructure services were provided. Now, however, we're shifting to a world where big companies like Microsoft or Google or Amazon provide those kinds of services through the cloud, through monthly subscriptions. And what used to be those kind of brick and mortar capital costs are now shifting to operating expenses as we license things in monthly licenses from the cloud. Moving up the proverbial stack, I'll talk a little bit about software. So it used to be if you were buying, say, an enterprise resource planning system or a human resource management system, you might go out to a request for proposal and find your leading proponent and buy a piece of software from them. You'd then install it on your servers running on the data center and run it for maybe 5 to 10 years. Again, that model was very much a capital cost to buy that license to install software and run it for 5 to 10 years. It had a long useful life and was definitely an asset. Today, however, a lot of those companies that provide those kinds of systems are shifting again to cloud-based subscription models where you might be paying monthly for software like Jira or Mural or Salesforce, those sorts of things. I think the last thing I'll talk to, and I'll go back again to the example I provided of those early days in the lab where many of us weren't too sure what the sustainment model was going to be. There's been a pretty big underinvestment in maintenance and continuous improvement of our technology and digital services in government. And I think there's just as proof to that, there was a recent internal audit that the Office of the Comptroller General did in BC last year that showed that an estimated 40% of all government systems are deemed legacy. And I think that just shows there's been an underinvestment in this space. So I also see us, as we spend a little bit more time and money looking after our systems, we're going to see a natural shift. So all of those things, I think, combine and to a world where we're definitely going to see increased operating costs in government in the next 5 to 10 years related to technology and digital service delivery.
I'm curious, is there a model of anywhere in the world that has much less legacy?
I have yet to see one in a government organization or even organizations of a similar kind of age as governments. And I think especially of, big banks or insurance companies, those sorts of companies, I've yet to see one that's really doing a great job of this. On the flip side, I think from the outside, at least, which is the only perspective I have, the tech sector tends to better manage its technology estate, mostly because that's what it sells as a service now. And so they literally cannot afford to have their products and services go out of date because customers will stop licensing them monthly, as is the business model for many of them.
So do you want BC to become a leader in this work then?
Absolutely. I think we have a real opportunity when I look at governments around the world for BC to lead in this space. I think we have such a strong foundation laid with the fact that we have a Deputy Minister's Committee on Digital and Data that's as knowledgeable and leaned in on these issues as we have here. We have a very unique sort of delegation from Treasury Board here, where that Deputy Minister Committee has delegated authority to review and approve most capital spending on technology in government. And I think we have a real opportunity to turn that into a really, really strong digital funding model in BC and strong governance model around that others around the world look to. Already we get calls from provinces and territories and even the federal government in Canada who are very interested in replicating our model. I think the thing they're most interested in is how we've set up governance around it and how we ended up with such an outstanding Deputy Ministers Committee that we have with the Deputy Ministers Committee on Digital and Data, and a lot of them already seem interested in replicating that. And I think as we further build and improve on that, we've got a real opportunity to lead in this space.
That's really exciting. And I like that the community that's been created to take it beyond here. Like, we're going to build something, but it's going to be shared.
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity. And one of my favorite things in the government space is a concept a friend of mine has long called policy plagiarism, and how that's encouraged. I think where it makes sense, borrowing from others is awesome, and we'll certainly be doing that. I mentioned New South Wales will be learning from organizations like them, but also I'd love to build something that we can export and others can use.
Despite more ministries moving to modernize their technologies and methodologies, siloed digital projects continue across the government. Along with digital funding transformation, do you also see an opportunity for a digital investment office to help foster collaboration and broader strategic alignment?
So I think we have such a cool bird's eye view on so much of the activity going on around government as teams are designing, building, buying, running digital products and services. And I see a real opportunity to make use of that. And I would say there's two ways we're going about doing that right now. The first thing that we're doing is and we've implemented that this past year as part of our annual intake cycle, is we've become a lot more intentional about how we're recommending that the Deputy Ministers Committee that we report into, named the Deputy Ministers Committee on Digital and Data, we're getting a lot more intentional on our recommendations on how they invest in technology. So we've translated government's digital framework into clear investment objectives for them. and even allocated money to funding to each of those objectives. So they approve that annually as part of their intake, and that allows us to be really intentional about where we're putting our dollars and how we're advancing government's digital agenda through those investments. Related, we've also in the last 2 to 3 years been really intentional about how we evaluate digital initiatives and making sure that as part of those evaluation criteria, we're looking at things like, whether you're perhaps building a product that has broader usability across government, or have you done appropriate upfront design research? Have you considered talking to that other ministry over there that's just implemented a similar system to see what you can learn and maybe even borrow some open source code? Have you thought about reusing this procurement vehicle over here? Have you considered potentially using this common component? So we've really strengthened our evaluation criteria to really promote more of an ecosystem approach. I think the second broad area I want to talk about a little bit is the work we're advancing in the common component space. So I talked a little bit about how we've got a bird's eye view. We also think that bird's eye view gives us sort of a great vantage point from which to inform the roadmaps for common components and perhaps even find gaps where there might be some value in some common components. And so we're formalizing that and standing up a team to help prioritize our common component investments and make sure those are easy to discover, useful, meet common needs, consistent to onboard to and use, and operate in a kind of dependable way so that teams can count that those common components will be running when they need them most, even if that's 2 a.m. when there's an influx of volume because of some event or another. So those are 2 ways we're doing this.
You mentioned you spend quite a bit of time researching and learning. What did that learning journey look like? How did you get at the right tables with the right people to learn more about the system before it became the job to fix the problem, your job to fix the problem?
That's a great question. I mentioned going back to school. That was definitely a big part of it. But I think there's a lot more than that is probably a lot more actionable. I think the biggest thing looking back that I did is just be curious and ask what felt at the time like dumb questions. And being curious and asking dumb questions every day eventually allows you to meet some really interesting people and learn a lot. And so I built great relationships with people who are now mentors of mine doing that. I think the other thing is not being afraid to really dig and to go. I talked a little bit in the live stream about going to read core policy, going to read legislation, going to read public accounts every year, which is something I do religiously. Go read the budget. All of those things, over time, when you do them consistently, you start spotting trends and you start really kind of learning how government works in really interesting ways. And that kind of digging paired with great relationships and mentorships that I've established over the years, asking dumb questions and being curious, is I think how I did it, and definitely something I would recommend others who want to go on a similar learning journey do. It was less about being at the right committee tables or anything like that. I don't think that's at all the path I was on. It was just being curious, reading a ton, reaching out to interesting people and asking a lot of questions and being curious. That's how I did it.
I find when you ask a question that you perceive maybe as a dumb question, more people in the room tend to have that same question. It just opens up the conversation as well.
I couldn't agree more. And I would say I probably still do that 10 times a day.
We're going to have quite a few links at the end of this of JP's how-tos, so you could just start learning and reading. So what is your North Star when it comes to digital transformation, when it comes to the BC government? Is there a team or government whose work inspires you?
Absolutely. I love this question. For me, I actually don't even like the word digital transformation. The way I think about it is people today, in many aspects of their lives, they access services digitally, whether it's corresponding with loved ones, getting groceries, ordering a cab, booking accommodations, learning about what's happening in the world. A lot of people do that through digital channels. So why is it that in those cases we're forcing a lot of them to more analog service delivery channels like call centers or brick and mortar locations? In my mind, there's a huge opportunity to evolve the way government delivers services to better reflect the needs and expectations of people in 2022. I think that will also strengthen our other channels and allow our awesome people running phone centers and staffing office locations to really provide tailored hands-on support to those who want it and need it. But I think there's also a really big chunk of the population that would probably prefer to access public service in seconds or minutes from their smartphones any time of day or night that is convenient to them, much like they would access other services and other aspects of their lives. So that for me is the North Star. It's all about service delivery. In terms of other teams or governments whose work inspires me, I'm really inspired by the government of New South Wales down in Australia. A few reasons for that. One, it's a very similar economy and population as BC. Two, they've just done such a great job on the digital agenda and have an awesome digital strategy oriented around life journeys for people, things like birth or name changes or becoming an adult. Those sorts of things are all life journeys that they've built digital experiences around, so that they've organized government around people, not force people to understand the way government is organized in order to interact with them. So I love that. Now, there's also one very nerdy reason that I love New South Wales, which is they've also translated that amazing digital strategy and that amazing sort of life journeys program into a crystal clear, outstanding investment approach with their digital restart fund, which I think should be a model that governments around the world look at when it comes to how do you fund technology.
Have you ever read any stats on their trust in government out there? Is it high?
I am not familiar with New South Wales, but my bet is they'd be probably markedly higher than most other governments.
What about products that have gone live but have yet to be funded for operations or continuous improvement? Is there any hope of saving these projects?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, as in the Digital Investment Office, as we've started casting a light on the importance of sustainment and maintenance and continuous improving and making sure that teams plan and budget for those up front. That's easy to address in the form of decision gates and transparency and things like that for any net new projects to make sure that those are taken care of. This is a really challenging area for products that may have recently gone live but don't have that support and have never actually had to show that as part of any governance processes. And I think there is hope for these projects, but I think it's all about the trio of technologists, program area people, and finance people getting together to come up with those solutions. So I always say the three of the really critical roles for getting this right: your CIO, your program area director or executive director, and your CFO getting in a room and solving these problems. And I think that's the way these sorts of situations would get solved, is those three roles getting together in a room on a sort of product by product or service by service basis and coming up with a game plan. But this is definitely a really challenging scenario.
Based on the varying funding sources for IMIT and or digital initiatives, for example, capital, operating, ministry, and federal, what recommendations do you have for teams to navigate this or create divisional or branch transparency around and keep track of, for example, not to go over just budget based on year-over-year budget allocation?
I have a really simple recommendation. Phone your CFO's office. This is literally their job, is to help program areas navigate this and ministries navigate this. And I find there's often a disconnect or hesitation where technologists are maybe a little bit fearful of picking up the phone and phoning their corporate finance departments. Increasing collaboration between technologists, program areas, and finance people is the key to this kind of issue. So rather than trying to give a nuanced, convoluted answer here and probably getting it wrong in 95% of the cases, I would say the single best thing you can do is pick up the phone and phone your chief financial officer. If in doubt on any of the topics we talked about today, I think that's a really good answer, is to phone your CFO and their teams.
So this is the first time you said pick up the phone throughout all the questions, but with the thoughts on curiosity and asking questions, it sounds like you picked up the phone a lot through your whole career to get things answered.
It's definitely a theme, is not being afraid to pick up the phone. I've been an introvert my whole life, and so that doesn't always come easy for me. But every time I do make the effort and talk myself into picking up that phone and making a call and asking a dumb question, I'm amazed at what comes out of those kinds of discussions, both awesome friendships, mentorships, and solutions to really tough problems.
That's one thing I was shocked for in the beginning of working in government. But when you pick up the phone to call someone, they're, for the most part, excited to talk to you and share their knowledge.
Absolutely. I think, as I said earlier, this is one of the most mission-oriented, amazing fields to work in, and that you can get a long ways doing that sort of thing. I think people often also look at org charts and think of government as a very hierarchical, top-down type of organization, and that's certainly true for many things. But I think the way government really works in many cases is, maybe informally works is a better word than really, is through networks. It's being able to pick up the phone and talk to someone and maybe get referred to someone else who's an expert. There's a lot of really hard problems that get solved in government every day, every hour, through networks, often informally.
So the last thing I'm going to ask you is, do you have any final thoughts?
Nothing more from me. I think I'll leave it there for now, Ari.
That's great. I really appreciate the stories and the detail and your time. So thanks again, JP, for taking time to share your thoughts. To the listeners, hope you enjoyed Fixing Digital Funding. You can connect with me at ari.hirschberg@gov.bc.ca or click the link show notes. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.